Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. As we work into tonight's topic, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank anyone who is joining for the first time and or listening for the first time. We get a lot of new followers every week and a lot of people interested. I get messages from a lot of you on various topics, and I'm really grateful for that. And if you have any questions or anything like that, you're always welcome to send them in, post them up, or even put them in the live chat here. All right, we verified that the audio is all working. We're good to go. Tonight I have just probably one of my favorite things that I think I've run across in all my reading. And that is a letter from the early church that we get to actually kind of pull apart and look into and read mostly in its entirety. I'm not going to promise to read every single sentence in here, but if you want a good introduction to this epistle, this letter that we have from the 2nd century, the mid, maybe even early 100s, the Epistle of Mathetes to Diognetus is perhaps one of my favorite letters from the first 500 years of church history. I don't say that lightly. There's a lot of amazing stuff that happens in the first 500 years, and a lot of stuff that I find personally fascinating. But this one kind of takes the cake for me. And I hope to be able to share that with you and why that is. In the video description and also in the podcast description, the live stream and everything else, I have a link to the translation that I am using. Fear not if you cannot access that right now. As you can see, I'll have it on the screen for you. No problem. If you are listening by way of podcast or in the audio, then you will find it in the show notes and be able to pull up the exact translation I'm using. If you can't see that, it's just it's just Roberts-Donaldson's translation of the Epistle to Mathetes to Diognetus. So we will be working through that. I wanted to go with one of the classic translations. Not that the new translations aren't good. They are good. I just wanted to go with the one that I'm familiar with. And so that's why. So no harm, no foul. So as we start with something like this, it is one of those things that kind of stands to us to understand, where we are kind of in church history, to understand where we are in the setting here and in everything else. So let me kind of break it down to you. In the 100s, one of the things that the early church had to do, and Christians, we see this kind of far and wide. We see Justin Martyr, we see a number of the apologists, men like Irenaeus, who are trying to explain to people who are not Christians what Christianity is. We are not crazy people. We are not this. Here's what we believe. And these types of things have been known throughout history since then. But some of the earliest apologists are the sources for a lot of us to look back and to see kind of snapshots of the church in various locations. One of the temptations, and I always mention this, and it's always a perennial warning. Anytime you look into a section of the church that is different from your time period or even different from your culture, the tendency is to extrapolate out whatever you learn of that one person or of that one letter or of that one church, and then expand it out to that's the entire early church. Everyone believed like that. Everyone acted like that. But that's not the case. We can even see in one of the earliest things that we have from the church, the Didache, that we spent an entire episode on, and we read in its entirety, the divergence of practices in the earliest church, even over things as central as baptism. They were expressing how they do it if there is an abundance of water, how they do it if there is a lack of water, how they are recommending they should do things, and yet even if you don't have cold water, I suppose tepid is okay. Even if you don't have running water, I suppose still is okay. If you don't have a lot of water, you can pour it on their heads. And these things are being written within the lifetime of a few of the apostles very early on. And so this is always a warning that I put out there when you're studying something so early on in church history, that do not extrapolate this out to mean that whatever the author of the Epistle of Mathetes to Diognetus says, that means that that's what the early church believed. Now, Would that make my case for certain Reformation doctrines much easier? Oh, yes, absolutely. Because this is perhaps one of the most Protestant Reformation sounding documents in the early church. However, and this is why I'm putting this warning out to you, I put the same warning out to Catholics and to Eastern Orthodox and to Protestants. Do not go to church history looking to validate yourself. This would be one of my favorite letters because, it does validate a lot of my very closely held core beliefs, and yet that is not what everyone in the early church held to. But that we see certain beliefs like this in the early church, the imputation of Christ's righteousness to the believer so clearly spelled out, the hope of resurrection, so many things we get to touch on tonight, and it is one of the reasons why it is my favorite letter, at least that I am aware of. There's a lot of stuff in the early church and in the imperial church that I've not read, but as far as for things I've run across, it is absolutely my favorite so far. And so I wanted to share that with you tonight, and so let's kind of go into this. Let's get the background of this. The Epistle of Mathetes to Diognetus. I know it sounds like we know who wrote it and to whom it was written, but the reality is we don't. Mathetes is simply the Greek word for disciple. It was a way, and you will see actually in the way that this Christian wrote this letter, he did not want to be remembered for his own name or for his own person. He wanted to simply serve God and then die in his care. This is something that I find deeply challenging and something that I find laudable, and certainly we'll spend our time focusing on it as he references that directly. So he signs the letter Mathetes. Mathetes, again, just the Greek word for disciple. It would just be like in our nomenclature in English today, signing it Christian. No different. And Diognetus, who this was written to, there's a few possibilities that are tossed out. Roberts-Donaldson's gave kind of the classic idea, which was that one of Marcus Aurelius's tutors had the name Diognetus, and there does seem to be some overlap of teachings and thoughts. I would say that would be wishful thinking. I would highly doubt that a Stoic philosopher's tutor is the one that this person's been. Crazier things have happened in church history, but we don't have any proof of that other than a few conjecture points and things. Possibility number 2 is that this is a guy by the name of Tiberius Claudius Diognetus, who was a Greek intellectual living around the same time, mid-100s. The only reason we would ever think either of those two people is because they share the same name. It wasn't that rare of a name, and so I don't like to push either of those theories. One, because it affects and it stains the way you think about this letter, and I hate that. I don't like that. I would rather us focus on things we know concretely, rather than possibilities and then have our imaginations run wild. That's how we get into trouble. That's how many churches have gotten into trouble. So what I say is likely the recipient is a man whose existence is unknown to history. We don't know who this was written to other than his name, and that he was curious about Christians, and obviously uninformed on some levels because of the way that the author will write to him. I'm going to call the author Mathetes, only because that's the only title he wanted us to remember himself by, so we will honor that. One of the stranger things about this letter is that it was unknown, at least quote-wise, to all the writers in church history for over 1,000 years, which is really quite fascinating. That doesn't mean that it didn't come from that time period. Linguistically, and all other ways, and everything else points to this was written in the first century of the church, right around 100 years after Christ. The language, the way that things are written, the structure of it, everything seems to fit very well with the claims of which it came from. Now, here's the reality. We only had one manuscript of this from the 13th century. There was a couple others that were in the exact same family of that, and lost that manuscript in a fire in the 1800s. So yay for the Franco-Prussian War. But a lot of copies were made, And we have the text, which is marvelous. And that's why I say at the bottom of the screen there, all we really have is the text that is in front of us. And that wasn't even published until after the Protestant Reformation. So it is one of those things that you'd be forgiven if you have taken church history, that you've never really run into this. You're not going to find it in many of the collections of church fathers, because, again, if you're looking at Schaff's church father collection, this is just a random letter from the early church. This is not a church father. It's not a person that's known. There was nobody quoting this. So as far as for influence in church history, this is not even tipping the scale off of a 0. However, as for interest, now that we are aware of its existence, that we can prove beyond any real historical doubt what this came from, the meaning that is behind this letter is really significant. And you will see this more and more. I promise I am not overselling this letter. It is a remarkable thing, but I will let it stand for itself as we go into it. Again, wasn't even published until after the Protestant Reformation. Let's look into this text. Now, a word on the text. Now, I want to spend as much time as I can in this text because it is not short. But I do, as you can see, I have it marked up because I want us to be able to see some of these things. One of the things I want to point out to you on the front end is this little piece right here. If you're following along the Roberts-Donaldson text, you're not going to find it notated there because it was still filled with questions back then. Roberts-Donaldson's was in the late 1800s. The last 2 chapters of the text that we have is almost certainly not original to the letter. It is one of those things that various periods in church history were not looking for, preservation of things like this with perfection. They were looking to add on or complete or to put better endings on, things like that. It happens in church history, and it's kind of one of those things that we have to spill out. We have to look at sentence structure. We have to look at the historical accountings of this. We have to look at, if there's multiple manuscripts to compare them to, because we're dealing with something so old, and because we're dealing with something that we have such a tiny amount of manuscript tradition from, we really have to rely heavily on the stuff inside. And I would concur with most of the scholarship on this would claim that these last 2 chapters do not belong to the hand of whoever Mathetes is, that he actually ended it here at chapter 10. And so I'm going to teach it in that vein. And so, yeah. And if you disagree with that, you're welcome to teach a class and teach all 12 chapters if you want to. But just that note on the front end, we're teaching these 10 chapters. So let's start as to why Mathetes is writing to Diognetus, because it is one of those things. Let's see. Okay, so I'm getting notation that when I go... Okay, let me do some live techno fixing here. Apparently when I go to full screen, my audio is problematic. Hang on a second. You know what? I'll just keep it off full screen. How's that? We'll keep it on this right here then. All right. So, the Epistle of Mathetes to Diognetus. Chapter 1, Occasion of the Epistle. Since I see thee, most excellent Diognetus, exceedingly desirous to learn the mode of worshipping God prevalent among the Christians, and inquiring very carefully and earnestly concerning them, what God they trust in, and what form of religion they observe, so as all to look down upon the world itself and despise death, while they neither esteem those to be gods that are reckoned such by the Greeks, nor hold to the superstition of the Jews, and what is the affection which they cherish among themselves, and why, in fine, this new kind of practice of piety has only now entered into the world, and not long ago. I cordially welcome this thy desire, and I implore God, who enables us both to speak and to hear, to grant me to so to speak, that above all I may hear you have been edified, and to you so to hear, that I who speak may have no cause of regret for having done so. Again, as is classic of mid second century. How would you express this? Mid second century push towards giving a defense of the faith. The occasion of the epistle here explains this idea that Diognetus had put forward some questions. There is a new religion in the world that he is seeking to understand. We want to know what their God is. We want to know how they observe it and in what way they carry on. And this we get directly from the text, that the act or the religion and the practice of the piety of Christians has only recently entered into the world. This is some of the phrasing that would help date this very early on. This is how the apologists of the 2nd century were writing. When you read Justin Martyr and his letter to Trypho the Jew, or you read Irenaeus even in the 180s and 190s, you will see this same kind of language, trying to establish the expectations of people to understand what Christianity actually is. And I am so deeply grateful for that, because the reality is that the earliest apologists, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and even here Mathetes, and several others of the 2nd century apologists, we have descriptions of the early church's theology. We have their practice of how they think about themselves and their situation in the world. Their pacifism, largely pacifistic, the earliest church, and their way of salvation, what they think about these things. Let me just make sure that tech issue is solved there. Well, I'll just leave me off of that and solve that tech problem later, and we'll just leave it right there then. I'll leave me minimized. Apparently, when I maximize my video here, the volume goes down, which is very weird because it shouldn't be doing that at all. No worries. I'm not going to try to figure that out here. I'll figure that out when I'm not live. All right, chapter 2. As he goes on, he says the first thing, and this you will find very fascinating. If you're familiar with the way God in the prophet Isaiah spoke in Isaiah 42, 43, and 44, and 45, that section right there on the vanity of idols, if you've ever read through that or studied through that, you're going to find a lot of allusions here, which I just love because it's one of my favorite sections of Isaiah. Listen to how he says this. He says, "Come then, after you have freed yourself from all prejudices possessing your mind, and laid aside what you have been accustomed to, as something apt to deceive you in being made, as if from the beginning a new man, inasmuch as, according to your own confession, you are to be the hearer of a new system of doctrine, come and contemplate, not with your eyes only, but with your understanding, the substance and the form of those whom you declare and deem to be gods." Now, so what he's saying here, he says, look, you have built into your own belief system as a most likely as a Greek thinker, obviously with the name Diognetus, it seems to be that. Of course, those names could have crossed over, but the way that Mathetes is writing to him, it does seem to indicate that he is talking to somebody with more of a Greek mindset than you would say expect from a more Roman mindset. The way that the Greek mindset would work would be to consider all sorts of claims for this. We even see this come up in the book of Acts, by the way, and Paul takes advantage of that to go in and while quoting Epicurus and some of the Stoic philosophers, he establishes the gospel in their ears, taking advantage of the fact that they valued in their religion and in their philosophy the hearing of new thinking and of new thoughts. And here, Mathetes is writing to Diognetus and saying the exact same thing. According to your own confession, you are to be the hearer of a new system of doctrine. Any new doctrine that comes along, you're given to contemplate it. And so he says, now, so I'm going to say you, instead of just contemplating mine, how about you analyze yours first? And that's an interesting thing, because you're going to see some overlap in, if you're familiar with even presuppositional apologetics, you're going to see overlap with that, because the whole idea is take what is expected and analyze it, not just to sell Christianity, because we're not doing that, but to defend Christianity. Part of that is the offense of defeating false beliefs. And so why do I hold to this and not to that? Well, it's not just because this is good, it is because this is wrong. And this is inconsistent with what we see in nature or in scripture or however you want to go down those roads. And so Mathetes is saying this. He says, come and contemplate this, not with your eyes only, but with your understanding, the substance and the form of those whom ye declare and deem to be gods. And again, here we have the strength of something we've lost in the English language. Ye is plural second person. It's the plural you. He's basically calling out his entire worldview. His worldview, that of the culture, that of his religion. And he's saying, look, this substance and form of those whom you all, in the South we have that, it's y'all, of whom you all declare and deem to be gods. And so what is he asks them, he says, is not one of them a stone, similar to that on which we tread? Is not a second one brass, in no way superior to those vessels which are constructed for our ordinary use? Bedpans and so forth, right? Is not a third wood, and that already rotten? Is not a fourth silver, which means needs a man to watch it, lest it be stolen? Is not a fifth made of iron consumed by rust? Is not a sixth earthenware, in no degree more valuable than that which is formed for the humblest of purposes? Are not all of these corruptible matter? Now, this is a fascinating question, because with the expectation that somebody like Diognetus would be given to a much more Greek mindset, matter itself was seen as mean. I don't mean, not like nasty. I mean, it was base. It was not something good. In Greek dualism, you had a much higher view of the spiritual plane, and as far as for the material world, it was seen as something that just tended towards disorder, it tended towards entropy, and therefore was actually a bad thing in their own definition. This is why the resurrection, when Paul was on Mars Hill, when he mentions the resurrection, it's why many of them left, because the resurrection was not the goal. The goal was to float on the ethereal cloud, to return back to the void from which we all came, right? And what he's saying here is the way you guys serve your gods is through corruptible matter, and all this corruptible matter. And this is very similar to the way God, in no uncertain terms, makes fun of idols and idol worshippers in the book of Isaiah, where he's saying, look, and let me take this off the top of my head, where he says, you go out to the woods and you find a piece of wood, you cut it in half. On one side you carve an idol, and the other piece you burn it on the fire to warm yourself. And he's like, it's the exact same piece of wood. He says you could even take the idol and throw it into the fire, and it can't even save itself, and yet you bow down to it, expecting that it can save you. This is something that makes you as foolish as they are. In fact, God will actually even express this, and here Mathetes will quote it. So I'm going to leave that off for just a second. He continues to ask him, he says, are they not all fabricated by means of iron and of fire? Did not the sculptor fashion one of them, and the brazier the second, the silversmith the third, the potter the fourth? Was not every one of them, before they were formed by the arts of these workmen into the shape of these gods, was not each one of them in its own way subject to change? Now this I love, because what he is doing is he is not just giving a defense of the Christian faith, he is pulling apart the worldview of the day in which he lived. This is something that Christians have done throughout history. It is something that sits on each of us. And I very much respect the way he's doing it, because the reality is that the belief of the Greek dualistic system, and also with its continuance of worship of the gods through idols, is inconsistent with itself. We have many inconsistencies with the worldview of the culture of the modern day in which we live, and this is our job. We need to show such inconsistencies. Inconsistencies of science, inconsistencies of matter, inconsistencies of creation mandates, and so forth. Those things need to be spelled out. We cannot just, as he's saying, to give a defense of the Christian faith, we cannot just put forward the Christian faith as if it is an equal claim to truth. No, it is an exclusive claim to truth, and everything else would be folly. Well, what does he continue saying? He says, will not those things which are now vessels formed by the same materials become like to such if they were met with the same artificers? In other words, if you have the silversmith that can make an idol, he can just unmake it. What good is this? Might not these which are now worshipped by you again be made by men vessels similar to others? In other words, there's no value in what it is. It's only what it is because we made it that way. But that's not how creation works. That's not how God works. In fact, how do idols work? They don't work at all. Are they not all deaf, he says? Are they not blind? Are they not without life? And again, if you've read Isaiah, anywhere in the 40s, you're going to see this type of logic coming out of Isaiah towards the idols of the world there. The same thing existed in the earliest church. The same thing exists today. The stuff that people worship has no life in it, and it does not lead them to life. It says, are they not destitute of feeling? Are they not incapable of motion? Are they not all liable to rot? Are they not all corruptible? These things that you all call gods, these you all serve, these you worship, and you become altogether like them. This is one of the most fascinating quotes out of this letter. There is a book written not too terribly long ago. I believe it was by G.K. Beale, B-E-A-L-E. We become what we worship. It is a very biblical concept. It is it is argued in multiple places in the Old Testament that those who worship idols become like them: blind, deaf, mute, paralyzed, dead. And here, Mathetes is using the exact same statements. You worship them and you become like them, because you always become like what you worship. Always, always, always. Here's some great wisdom to pull out of church history. You become like what you worship. Every single time. It's one of the reasons why on Sundays I very often will pray that we worship God as he reveals himself to be, not as we would prefer him to be. Because I don't want to worship a God after my own imagination. I will just become what my imagination wants. I want to worship God as he reveals himself to be, that I may become more like him. I don't want to become more like my imagination of God. I want to become more like God. In fact, Mathetes turns this all around on him, says, for this reason you all hate the Christians, because they do not deem these to be gods, but do not you yourselves, who now think and suppose such to be gods, much more cast contempt upon them than they, the Christians, do? Do ye not much more mock and insult them when you worship those that are made of stone and earthenware, without appointing any persons to guard them? But those made of silver and gold you shut up by night, and appoint watchers to look after them day by day, lest they be stolen. This is fascinating. The way he is using this logic against them is to actually say, if these gods be true gods, and their value be on the form of spiritual value, high, spiritual, transcendent, and above this, the place of forms, not the place of shadows, as Plato would put it, if that is so, then those who are guarding these idols should not just be guarding the silver and the gold ones. They should be guarding the earthenware and the stone ones. But you all know in your heart that they have no value whatsoever. And so does everyone else. And what Mathetes is doing here is he's just using their own inconsistencies against them. Seriously, presuppositional apologetics in the 2nd century, just remarkable. By those gifts which ye mean to present to them, do ye not, if they are possessed of sense, rather punish than honor them? But if, on the other hand, they are destitute of sense, ye convict them of this fact, while you worship them with blood and the smoke of sacrifices. Let any one of you suffer such indignities. Let any one of you endure to have such things done to himself, but not a single human being will, unless compelled to it, endure such treatments, since he is endowed with sense and reason. A stone, however, readily bears it, seeing as it is insensible. certainly you do not show by your conduct that he, your God, is possessed of sense. This is oh boy, one of those fancy words that people use in seminaries these days. What is it? Winsomeness. This idea that in order to win people over to the side of the gospel or whatnot, we need to be really nice and really pleasant and all of these things. The reality is, if we have to sacrifice truth in order to do that, we end up hamstringing ourselves. And one of the things that I think Mathetes does well, and I believe he has earned this after such a statement of this, is in all of these things, you actually demonstrate that you know there is no sense in that pile of rocks that you worship. And as to the fact that Christians are not accustomed to serve such gods, I might easily find many other things to say, but if even what has been said does not seem to anyone sufficient, I deem it idle to say anything further. I think that might be my new way to sign emails. I might easily find many other things to say, but if even what has been said does not deem to anyone to be sufficient, I deem it idle to say anything further. That's just a great email signature file. Fantastic. Chapter 3, keep going. The superstition of the Jews, right? This was one of the earliest things. Now, when we were talking in the first century, we talked a lot about the fact that it was difficult for Romans to understand the difference between Jews and Christians. It seemed to them that Christians were a different form of the Christian sect. But in reality, as we well know, we are not Jews. And one of the things that continually frustrated people in the earliest church, and that is in the book of Acts, what the Jerusalem council was over, all of the stories of Peter and John going to Cornelius' house, and all of these revelations that were coming from God, that salvation wasn't going to stay with the Jews. Salvation came of the Jews, sure. There was certain honors that were given to the Jewish people in a very unique sense, but the reality is that salvation didn't stay with the Jews. Salvation instead went to the Gentiles. It went, as the book of Acts explains, from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the world. And here we see trying to make distinguishing marks between the Jews and the Christians, because the reality is everyone knew what the Jews were. In fact, one of the emperors earned his name as the son of the current emperor by laying siege to Jerusalem and taking it over and bringing back all of the treasures from the Jerusalem temple after they destroyed it. When I was in Rome this past summer, I walked by his arch, the Arch of Triumph of Titus, from the sacking of Jerusalem in the year 70 A.D. And there, menorah and all sorts of things that they took out of the temple. It is so people knew who the Jews were. They'd known for hundreds of years. That was not a question anymore. The question was, who is this new religion that is rising up in the world? Again, a testament to how early on this is, that such a type of apology needs to be written. He says, next, I imagine that you are most desirous of hearing something on this point, that the Christians do not observe the same forms of divine worship as do the Jews. The Jews, then, if they abstain from the kind of service above described, and deemed it proper to worship one God as being Lord of all, are right. But if they offer him worship in the way which we have described, they greatly err. For while the Gentiles, by offering such things to those that are destitute of sense and hearing, furnish an example of madness, they, meaning the Jews, on the other hand, by thinking to offer these things to God as if he needed them, might justly reckon it rather an act of folly than of divine worship. This is a really interesting perspective that he puts forward here. Is what he is expressing is that there was a common practice of Jews in the 2nd century that was going on that he's apparently aware of, where they would be offering things to God out of God's need. He has need of us. And what Mathetes is saying is that in and of itself would not just be something destitute of sense and hearing or an act of madness. This would just be an act of foolishness. An act of madness is bowing down to an idol. An act of foolishness is worshiping God as though he needs our worship to subsist. And what he is expressing is that's not how Christians worship at all. Look at this. For he that made heaven and earth, and all that is therein, and gives to us all the things of which we stand in need, certainly requires none of these things which he himself bestows on such as think of furnishing them to him. In other words, our worship is not feeding God, it is not taking care of God, it is not boosting his morale, it is not doing any of those things. Worship changes us, not God. That's what Mathetes is getting across. This is what he sees, at least in the situation where he is, wherever that is one of the defining differences between the Greeks, the Jews, and Christians. He says, but those who imagine that by means of blood and the smoke of sacrifices and burnt offerings, they have for sacrifices acceptable to him, and that by such honors they show him respect, these, by supposing that they can give anything to him who stands in need of nothing, appear to me in no respect to differ from those who studiously confer the same honor on things destitute of sense, and which therefore are unable to enjoy such honors. It is an interesting put forward that he has here. And again, we see some of the struggles of the early church trying to, or at least parts of the early church, I want to speak specifically here, parts of the early church trying to explain the differences between the Jewish religion and that of the Christians. While we share the same scriptures, we see them fulfilled in Jesus Christ. They do not. They are still awaiting a Messiah, so they see themselves still as Old Testament saints, as we would kind of refer to that. They would just see themselves as Israel. And what Mathetes is explaining here is, he says that there is no part of the same. In fact, the Jewish religion has gone so far off base that the vast majority of them have rejected the one Messiah that came. And so we can't be looking at the majority of Jews in the 1st and 2nd century and saying all of them legitimately worship God. Not if they reject the Messiah. That is one of the main topics of the book of the Gospels and the book of Acts, is that there was a staunch rejection of God as he reveals himself to be in the person and work and words of Jesus Christ. Chapter 4. He says it doesn't even stop there. He says the other observances of the Jews demonstrate the same thing. And if you're going to understand who Christians are, you need to understand who Jews are of the day, because that's who they were trying to liken them to, right? What does he say? But as to their scrupulosity, great word, by the way, you should add to your vocabulary. Scrupulosity is a scruples, a constant focus on minor things in the world, just being very meticulous. Their scrupulosity concerning meats and their superstition as respects to Sabbaths, and their boastings about circumcision, and their fancies about fastings and new moons. If you're familiar with Colossians chapter 2, that is a direct reference to that, which is quite fascinating, especially in context here, which are utterly ridiculous, he says, and unworthy of notice. I do not think that you require to learn anything from me, for to accept some of those things which have been formed by God for the use of men as properly formed, and to reject others as useless and redundant, how can this be lawful? And to speak falsely of God, as if he forbade us to do what is good on the Sabbath days. Now stop for a second. That is direct allusion to Jesus's teaching on the nature of Sabbath days when he is confronted by the Jewish rulers. Is it good to do wrong on the Sabbath day, or good to do good on the Sabbath day? The Sabbath was not made so that man would serve it. He says, in fact, not only am I Lord of the Sabbath, but the Sabbath itself was made for man. He never forbade us to do good things on the Sabbath simply because of rules and scruples. How is not this impious, he asks, and to glory in the circumcision of the flesh as if it is a proof of election, and as if on account of it they were specially beloved by God? How is it not a subject of ridicule? In other words, in all these things, if you put your confidence in the flesh, I mean, you can hear Paul's theology just flowing through this guy. If you're putting, this is Philippians chapter 3, if you're putting confidence in the flesh, in your circumcision, it says, no, what does Paul say? We are the true circumcision who worship God by Spirit and put no confidence in the flesh. Here you have Mathetes saying the same thing here. Circumcision of the flesh is not proof of election. That's not how any of this has ever worked. That's not how it worked in the Old Testament. It certainly isn't the way now that the Messiah has come into the world. It has never been that way. Same goes for baptism. All right, I'll move on. And as if, on account of it, they were specially beloved by God, how is it not a subject of ridicule? And as to the observance of months and days, as if waiting upon the stars and the moon, and their distributing according to their own tendencies, the appointments of God and the vicissitudes of the seasons, some for festivities and others for mourning, who would deem this a part of divine worship, and not much rather a manifestation of folly? For all of my friends who really, really, really love church calendars and the church year and things like this, this is one of those things that does remind us not all Christians agree with that. And not all Christians have always focused on all these things where we're by this. And for those of us who pay attention to astrology, this would be a warning also. Wisdom from the earliest church. Those things have nothing to do with the realities of God's appointments and decrees. Now, do they foretell? Do they express? Do they reveal certain things? No. Do they speak forth knowledge of the one who made them, the power that he has, the eternal divine nature and his eternal power? Yeah, that's what they speak. That feeling you get when you look up into the sky of, my goodness, whose hand made all of this? That's what they're there for. And yeah, they're given for times and seasons and for the navigations of sea ships and all sorts of things. Yeah. But in the end, the purpose is not to lead us to us figuring out our future. This is where astrology goes wrong. The purpose of all of these things was to lead us to God. And if he is not the destination, then you're doing it wrong. Even if it is a part of the natural world. Mathetes continues, he says, I suppose, then, you are sufficiently convinced that the Christians properly abstain from the vanity and error common to both Jews and Gentiles, and from the busybody spirit and vain boasting of the Jews, but you must not hope to learn the mystery of their peculiar mode of worshiping God from any mortal. In other words, he's trying to put forward some of the most definingly different characteristics of Jews versus Christians. And so now he's going to describe Christians. This is a fascinating description. Again, we're talking year-wise. I didn't say what year this was written in because we really don't know. This is kind of like randomly finding a letter that you know has been sitting around for 1800 years, 1900 years, and trying to pull out of it information that just isn't there. We know it's early, very early. The era of the apologists, we know by linguistics and everything else. We are talking 130s, 140s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, somewhere mid-second century, mid-100s. Listen to this description. For the Christians are distinguished from other men neither by country, nor language, nor the customs which they observe. For they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a peculiar form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. The course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation or deliberation of inquisitive men, nor do they, like some, proclaim themselves the advocates of any merely human doctrines, but, inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them has determined, and following the customs of the natives in respect to clothing, food, and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. That's probably one of my favorite descriptions of Christians I've ever read. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. You cannot pull them apart by how they dress. You cannot pull them apart by any specific habit. You cannot pull them apart by their language nor their customs that they observe. They are ordinary in their conduct. They go to work. They are typical. It would be hard to pull them out of a crowd, and yet they dwell wherever they are. Greek, barbarian, doesn't matter. They dwell in their own countries as God has given them. They are there as sojourners. Watch the rest of the descriptions. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as foreigners. Now here you're going to see the two sides back and forth. Very classic presentation at this point in history. They share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if they are foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry, as do all. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. Here would be a defining characteristic. They don't kill their children. There's two massive ways this was done in the Roman Empire. One was by exposure after birth. The other one was through abortion. They do not do this, either of them. In fact, the early church was known for finding ways to adopt these children. Here, he says one of the defining characteristics of them is that they see value in their children. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They find value in sexual morality, in the boundaries of such as defined by God. They also have a common table, which means that there is a broad openness and welcoming spirit to those to their table. They will be hospitable to anyone, but they will be regulated as far as immorality is concerned. They are in the flesh. Oh, just these side by sides are just stellar reasoning. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time, they surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men, and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things, and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They are evil spoken of, and yet are justified. They are reviled and bless. They are insulted, and repay the insult with honor. Again, following the methods of Christ. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice, as if quickened unto life. Everything in this, by the way, you need to hear is grinding against Diognetus' worldview. This is foolishness to see this. Let's continue. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners and are persecuted by the Greeks. Yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. Chapter 6. The relation of Christians to the world. To sum up all in one word, what the soul is in the body, that are Christians in the world. The soul is dispersed throughout all the members of the body, and Christians are scattered throughout all the cities of the world. The soul dwells in the body, yet it is not of the body. The Christians dwell in the world, and yet are not of the world. The invisible soul is guarded by the visible body, and Christians are known indeed to be in the world, but their godliness remains invisible. In other words, we're not doing our works in front of men. The flesh hates the soul, and wars against it, though itself suffers no injury, because it is prevented from enjoying pleasures. The world also hates the Christians, though in no wise injured, because they abjure pleasures. The soul loves the flesh that hates it, and loves also the members. Christians likewise love those who hate them. The soul is imprisoned in the body, and yet preserves that very body. And Christians are confined in the world as a prison, and yet they are the preservers of the world. The immortal soul dwells in a mortal tabernacle, and Christians dwell as sojourners in corruptible bodies, looking for an incorruptible dwelling in the heavens. Again, you're going to hear 1 Corinthians 15 coming through here. Not that we would be less clothed, obviously, but that would be further clothed. In other words, the body is not bad, but it is not the end story. In this state, it is fallible in this state. We look for the incorruptible tent, right? Let's continue. The soul, when but ill provided with food and drink, becomes better in like manner. And this is a belief regarding regarding fasting and so forth, becomes better. In like manner, the Christians, though subjected day by day to punishment, increase the more in number. God has assigned them this illustrious position, which it were unlawful for them to forsake. This idea is very prevalent in the early church, and it should be prevalent in the modern church, but sadly it has all but died. This idea that our sufferings are ours to embrace, and it is not lawful for us to forsake our sufferings. What God passes us through is a gift. We know it's a gift because it is our life. And because God, who loves us dearly, walks by our side and brings us through those things. You say, well, wouldn't it be better for me if I didn't pass through those things? I would argue no. I've lost many people that I love dearly within the last 15 months. Many. Nearly half a dozen very formative people of my life have all passed away in the last 16 months. I thank God for this. Not because it's enjoyable. It's not enjoyable. But because this is the path that God is leading me down. This is where in which He has placed me. And it's not lawful for us to forsake. I take that wisdom to heart. I'd recommend any one of you do. Look at the way he talks about Christ. You want to talk about early Christology outside of the New Testament books. Chapter 7, the manifestation of Christ. Listen to this amazing description of Jesus. For as I said, Mathetes says here, this was no mere earthly invention which was delivered to them, meaning Christians, nor is it a mere human system of opinion, which they judge it right to preserve so carefully, nor has a dispensation of mere human mysteries been committed to them, but truly God Himself, who is Almighty, the Creator of all things, and invisible, has sent from heaven and placed among men Him who is the truth, and the holy and incomprehensible Word. Yes, that's the Greek word there, logos, and has firmly established Him in their hearts. He does not, as one might have imagined, send to men any servant or angel or ruler or any one of those who bear sway over earthly things, or one of those to whom the government of things in the heavens has been entrusted, but the very Creator and Fashioner of all things, by whom He made the heavens, by whom He enclosed the sea within its proper bounds, whose ordinances all the stars faithfully observe, from whom the sun has received the measure of his daily course to be observed, whom all the moons obey, being commanded to shine in the night, and whom the stars also obey, following the moon in her course, by whom all things have been arranged and placed within their proper limits, and to whom all are subject, the heavens and the things that are therein, the earth and the things that are therein, the sea and the things that are therein, fire, air, and the abyss, and the things which are in the heights, the things which are in the depths, and the things which lie between. This He sent to them. Was it then, as one might conceive, for the purpose of exercising tyranny, or of inspiring fear and terror? By no means, but under the influence of clemency and meekness. As a king sends his son, who is also a king, so sent He him. As God He sent Him, and as to men He sent Him. As a Savior He sent them. He sent Him, and as seeking to persuade, not to compel us, for violence has no place in the character of God. As calling us, He sent Him, not as vengefully pursuing us, but as loving us, He sent Him, not as judging us. For He will yet send Him to judge us, and who shall endure His appearing? That is a fascinating treatise on the nature of Christ and who it was that came into this world. That is some very high Christology. You will find it influenced by Paul, by Luke, by John, massively by John here. That's just an incredible statement about Jesus of Nazareth. And this whole point is even drawing this line of demarcation between the two advents of Christ. In the one, we have Christ coming into the world, lovingly pursuing those whom he has placed his salvific love upon and whom the Father has given to him. He is not compelling us, but he is saving us. One day he will come back as judge. But that hasn't occurred yet. And that's what Mathetes is spelling out. The first time Christ did not come with a sword. He will send him yet to judge us. And who shall endure his appearing? I want you to see chapter 8 here. The miserable state of men before the coming of the Word. What was the state of mankind before the Messiah? This is how he's going to spell this out. For who of men at all understood before his coming what God is? Do you accept the vain and silly doctrine of those who are deemed trustworthy philosophers, of whom some said that fire was God, calling that God to which they themselves were by and by to come, and some water, and others some of the other elements formed by God? But if any one of those theories be worthy of approbation, every one of the rest of created things might also be declared God. In other words, if God is a part of his creation, then we can well establish that perhaps any part of God's creation could be him. These teachings, by the way, are coming back to Christianity. They're going to be very much in vogue soon enough, because I have heard them at the highest echelons of teaching, and this idea that God can be in all things and found everywhere and all this kind of stuff. A very soft form of pantheism is certainly coming back to the heretical forms of Christianity, and we need to be prepared for that because it's there. But such declarations, Mathetes says, such declarations are simply the startling and erroneous utterances of deceivers. And no man has either seen him or made him known, but he has revealed himself. This is why we do not take man's words on who God is. Because no one has ever seen God like that. The only God, right? This sounds just like the Gospel of John. The way he explains these things in chapter 1. No one has ever seen God at any time. The only begotten. But we beheld God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ. He has actually revealed himself. We didn't even ask for that. In fact, nobody was expecting the Messiah to actually be God himself. We couldn't figure that out. Mathetes continues, he says, and he has manifested himself through faith, to which alone it is given to behold God. For God, the Lord and fashioner of all things, who made all things, and assigned them their several positions, proved himself not merely a friend of mankind, but also long-suffering, patient in his dealings with them. Yea, he was always of such a character, and still is, and will ever be, kind and good, and free from wrath and true, and the only one who is absolutely good. And he formed in his mind a great and unspeakable conception, which he communicated to his Son alone. As long then as he held and preserved his own wise counsel in concealment. In other words, here again, we see language so very close to that of the New Testament. This idea of the mystery of salvation and how it would actually work. This concealed counsel of God's own wisdom. Because God concealed the exact nature of what he was doing, he's appearing neglectful to us. How many of you, having passed through or are passing through times of difficulty, have not felt that way? That God is neglecting you or ignoring you? has no care over you. That is not a new feeling. That is a very human feeling. And yet we have the promises of God. For all these times of God's long-suffering and his wise counsel of concealment, which, by the way, just because we have the New Testament does not mean that God's wise counsel is completely revealed to us. It is not. There are many times in the Christian life where God appears to be neglectful of us and to have no care over us. Many times. And if you haven't experienced it yet, buckle up. They are coming. But after he revealed and laid open through his beloved Son the things which have been prepared from the beginning, at least as far as salvation is concerned, he conferred every blessing all at once upon us, so that we would both share in his benefits and see and be active in his service. Who of us would ever have expected these things? He was aware then of all things in his own mind, along with his Son, according to the relation subsisting between them. You've got to understand just how significant some of these statements are coming from the early to mid 100s. Outside of Scripture, we only have not even a handful of references like this, of this kind of theology. Whoever this person is somebody I would like to learn from. And it's one of the reasons why I love reading this, because the way he thinks, you got to understand, when you're looking at good theologians today, when you're looking at good pastors today, these men are standing on the shoulders of all sorts of generations and authors and commentators and linguistic studies. We sit at a time where we have access to all sorts of things. Do away with all of that. No Luther, no Calvin, no Wycliffe, no Gregory, no Leo, no Augustine, no Athanasius, no Eusebius, no Lactantius, no Justin Martyr, no Irenaeus, no Tertullian, and go all the way back. All you have is a yet to be fully understood canon of the New Testament. Several of the books of the New Testament that this author has obviously read and is alluding to very heavily. No fully agreed upon canon. No theologians tested by time and by centuries. And to be able to sit down and write this. Is everything 100% perfect, exact? No. But it is impressive. I could have lived to 100 years old at that point in history. I wouldn't have had a mind to write this. This guy just blows my mind. I can't even imagine trying to piece together the nature of the significance of the coming of Christ being in the situation of the 2nd century. That is just astounding to me. Just astounding to me. And look at this just incredible answer to the title of chapter 9. Why the Son was sent so late. You ever wondered that? Why did Jesus come so late into the world? Why not all the way back at the Garden of Eden? He puts forward the question. One of those things that I am sure he is anticipating that Diognetus would be answering back to him. He argues, Mathetes says, as long then as the former time endured, God permitted us to be borne along by unruly impulses, being drawn away by the desire of pleasure and various lusts. This was not that he at all delighted in our sins, but that he simply endured them, nor that he approved the time of working iniquity, which then was, but that he sought to form a mind conscious of righteousness, so that being convinced in that time of our unworthiness of attaining life through our own works, it should now through the kindness of God be vouchsafed to us. I don't know why that is not bolded in here. It's one of my favorite statements. Hang on a second. Let me fix that. Being vouchsafed to us. Because next time I come through and read this, I want to... Yeah, you're going to see me edit things real time. That is just fine. Notice what he just said here. Throughout all of this history before Jesus, he says, in all of that time, what is it? You know, the question always goes, what was God waiting for? The answer is actually found in what we were doing. We were learning that our unworthiness of attaining life through our own works is the order of the day. This is what is normal. We are not capable of attaining life through our own works. And instead, should anticipate that through the kindness of God, it be vouchsafed for us. Having made it manifest that in ourselves we were unable to enter into the kingdom of God, we might through the power of God be made able. Now here you're about to see one of the greatest descriptions of salvation. And I love it. Let's just keep going. When our wickedness had reached its height, and it had been clearly shown that its reward, being punishment and death, was impending over us, and when the time had come which God had before appointed for manifesting his own kindness and power, how the one love of God, through exceeding regard for men, did not regard us with hatred, nor thrust us away, nor remember our iniquity against us, but showed great patience, and bore with us. He himself took on him the burden of our iniquities. He gave his own Son as a ransom for us, the Holy One for the transgressors, the blameless one for the wicked, the righteous one for the unrighteous, the incorruptible one for the corruptible, the immortal one for them that are mortal. For what other thing was capable of covering our sins than his righteousness? By what other one was it possible that we, the wicked and ungodly, could be justified than by the only Son of God? O sweet exchange! O unsearchable operation! O benefits surpassing all expectation, that the wickedness of many should be hid in a single righteous one, and that the righteousness of one should justify many transgressors. That's probably one of the finest things I've ever read. Having therefore convinced us in the former time, he continues, that our nature was unable to attain to life, and having now revealed the Savior who is able to save even those things which it was formerly impossible to save, by both these facts he desired to lead us to what? To do good works and therefore outweigh our bad? No. What does he say? In all of these, he desired to lead us to trust in his kindness and to esteem him our nourisher, Father, teacher, counselor, healer, our wisdom, light, honor, glory, power, and life, so that we should not be anxious concerning things like clothing and food. Chapter 9 there is just mind-blowing. To realize that that is being written in the 100s. To a man with no deep history behind him. He knows enough about Christ to know that his own name is not worthy of being preserved through the history of mankind. That he is satisfied that his Savior alone remembers him. That is deeply humiliating to me. Just on a personal note with this, one of the things that my mind has been racking back and forth about the past several months, a normal response to grief, I know, but is on the subject of legacy. What do I leave behind me? How do I do that? How do I ensure it's good? And I've been learning what apparently Mathetes here had in spades, which is legacy for your own name dies with you. I love that he just calls himself disciple. He doesn't even give us his name. He's not even talking about his own life. He is just talking about his God and other Christians. That's quite humbling to read, honestly. Let's go to his last chapter here. Chapter 10, the blessings that flow from faith. He says to Diognetus, he says, if you also desire to possess this faith, you likewise shall receive, first of all, look at this, the knowledge of the Father. For God has loved mankind, on whose account he made the world, to whom he rendered subject all things that are in it, to whom he gave reason and understanding, to whom alone he imparted the privilege of looking upwards to himself, whom he formed after his own image, to whom he sent his only begotten Son, to whom he has promised a kingdom in heaven, and will give it to those who have loved him. And when you have attained this knowledge, with what joy do you think you will be filled? Or how will you love him who first so loved you? Again, 1 John. Jeez, it's everywhere. And if you love him, you will be an imitator of his kindness. Ephesians 5. And do not wonder that a man may become an imitator of God. He can if he is willing. For it is not by ruling over his neighbors, or by seeking to hold the supremacy over those that are weaker, or by being rich and showing violence toward those who are inferior, that happiness is found. Nor can any one of these things become an imitator of God. But these things do not at all constitute his majesty. Now, I want to point out something that I learned very early on, and it's a wisdom that Mathetes here is actually expounding on. He's saying very much the same thing. How you treat those who are your underlings, how you treat those who are in your charge, whether they be children, whether they be employees, whether they be younger siblings or whatnot, that is a reflection of how you think God treats you. Let that sink in for a second. It is a reflection of how you think God treats you. And if it is through violence towards those who are inferior, or by supremacy over those who are weaker, by ruling over people and destroying them, or in any way doing these things, no, this is not imitating God. These things do not constitute his majesty, but it certainly reflects what you think does. Mathetes considers it further. He says, on the contrary, he who takes upon himself the burden of his neighbor, he who, in whatsoever respect he may be superior, is ready to benefit another who is deficient. He who, whatsoever things he has received from God, by distributing those to the needy, becomes a God to those who receive his benefits. He is an imitator of God. In other words, he is establishing this reality to these things. Generosity should come and flow out of a heart that is recognized that God has been generous with us. Forgiveness flows out of the heart that realizes that unless God has forgiven me, I am still in my sins. It is a natural one-to-one relationship between these things. Those whom God forgives gain a forgiving heart. They do not seek to destroy other people that they view less than them. Then, he says, thou shalt see while still on earth that God in the heavens rules over the universe. Where? By holding the scepter of divine overwhelming power over the heads of those who are his enemies? No. He is ruling in the hearts of his people and in their service and love to one another. Then, he says, Mathetes says, then thou shalt begin to speak the mysteries of God. Then shalt thou both love and admire those that suffer punishment because they will not deny God. Then shalt thou condemn the deceit and error of the world, when thou shalt know what it is to live truly in heaven, when thou shalt despise that which is here esteemed to be death, when thou shalt fear what is truly death, which is reserved for those who shall be condemned to the eternal fire, which shall afflict those even to the end that are committed to it. Then shalt thou admire those who for righteousness' sake endure the fire that is but for a moment, and shalt count them happy when thou shalt know the nature of that fire. That reference to the temporality of martyrdom and its suffering, and the eternal nature of the fire that comes to those who are doing the martyring. And saying, in service of God, everything about our expectations, everything about our understanding of the economy of the world, of what is valuable, of what is good, of what is pain, of what is suffering, of what is blessing, our definition of all of those things will change upon following Christ, upon worshiping God as he reveals himself to be, rather than as we would prefer him to be, or as we would expect him to be. A remarkable letter, one of my favorite artifacts of the early church. Thank you all for going through it with me, all 10 chapters. Again, leaving off the last 2, which are almost certainly unrelated to this, but are a later addition. Mathetes, whoever you are, thank you. Thank you for your wisdom, and thank you for your humility. Thank you all for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.